Hello, everyone. My name's Charles Godfrey. I'm director of the Martin School. Welcome to the Martin School. It's an enormous pleasure to introduce Henry Dimbleby, who's talking this afternoon. Henry read physics and philosophy at St. John's and then went on to set up the Leon restaurant chain. Was co-founder of Leon. And since then has been involved in a lot of things around food policy. Wrote a report on school meals in the UK, has been a non-executive director at DEFRA, and a couple of years back published the National Food Strategy, which has had the most enormous influence on discussions about food in this country. Now, I thought the National Food Strategy was really written very well and easy to read, but Henry, with his wife, Jemima Lewis, have taken it and elaborated into this wonderful book, Ravenous, that Henry's going to be talking about this afternoon. And I think it's just a matter of time before we have the film of the National Food Strategy, and then the mini-series and the stage adaptation. So Henry, with no more ado, let me ask you to take the stage.
Thank you very much, Charles. Normally, when I'm talking about the National Food Strategy, I can be pretty sure that I'm, if not the most qualified in the room to talk about it, at least in the top 5. And I've walked into here and seen at least 10 people who are experts in fields, many of who actually gave me time in helping think through the National Food Strategy and then write the book. So I'm approaching this with some trepidation. And hopefully I'll get everything right for you. I thought what would be useful to do, the reason that we wrote the book was you change systems in two complex systems in two ways. The first thing you have to do is you have to make sure that people understand the system. You have to make sure people understand how the system works as it does, because until you understand how it works as it does, you can't make the interventions to change it. And then the second thing, if it's a system that needs intervention on a national level, is that you put in place some policies and you try and change the incentives in the system to get the outcome that you want. And the National Food Strategy, we very explicitly tried to do those two things. My wife, Jemima Lewis, the journalist, worked on it unpaid with me and the team for quite a few years, and the intention was to create not just a recommendation of a set of policies, but a story that explained how the system worked, because almost everything that most people think is true about how the food system works is wrong, and we don't stand a chance of fixing it until we can tell that story and until people understand that story. And as soon as we had, in July of 2021, as soon as we'd kind of, literally on the day actually, when we were running around launching the strategy, we realized that actually the number of people who are going to download a government report from a website and read it is vanishingly small, probably a significant proportion of them I can see in this room. And we needed to actually get those ideas out there more broadly, and that's why we wrote the book. And I thought today I'd just have a little rattle through what those ideas were, and then I think we've got time for questions at the end. I think when you look at something that's going very badly wrong, and the food system is going very badly wrong, it is the biggest cause of disease, of non-communicable disease, and the biggest cause of environmental destruction globally, you really have to try and understand how you got there. And how we got to where we are is actually one of the great stories of human ingenuity. We have the food system that we had today because we solved a huge problem. And we describe this in the food strategy in the book as a miracle. And that miracle really started just after the war. Despite all the bloodshed during the war, more people were alive in 1945 than had ever been alive at once, 2.5 billion people. And scientists at the time looked at the likely improvements in sanitation, in medicine, in living conditions, and they projected that over the next 50 years, the population of the world might grow from 2.5 to 8 to 10 billion. And this was a problem. This was a problem because in human history, since the Holocene, the time of stable climate that started around 10,000 BC, when we started to farm, we started to be able to plan enough because of stable weather to farm, when the human population had grown, we had simply dug up more land to plant more food, and that's what we did. We grew, we dug up more land, we planted food. And this chart shows this story just from 1800 up to the beginning of the war, and it's got 3 lines on it. It's got the green line, which was the amount of land that was in agricultural production in any given year. It has the black line, which was the population of the planet in that year, and the red line, which is the total amount of calories that humans produced for consumption in that year. And the problem was, by 1945, we had actually dug up almost all of the land. There was not, we would need 4 times the amount of land to feed the planet. That land didn't exist. And if you go back and you look at the newspapers in the late 40s and early 50s, there's a recurring theme, this Malthusian prediction that the human race, its growth is going to be limited by famine because we won't be able to feed everyone. This was like, in the way that in my childhood, nuclear war, and now nuclear war, was the big existential risk. If you go back to the 40s and 50s, after war, alongside nuclear war, you had this risk of Malthusian collapse, famine. And what these scientists hadn't reckoned on was a young botanist from Idaho, a man called Norman Borlaug. Borlaug had grown up in the Depression. He had seen food riots, he'd seen hunger close up, and he had set himself a lifelong mission to help people eat properly. And he found himself at the end of the Second World War in 1945 in Mexico, where he'd been sent by the Rockefeller Foundation to try and see if he could improve the farming techniques in Mexico. And when he arrived, he was shocked by what he saw. He wrote back to his wife that the soil was so poor, the subsistence farmers barely scraped a living. He said, "These places have clubbed my mind. I don't know what we do, but we've got to do something." At the time, Mexico imported about half the wheat it ate, and most of the population were living on starvation rations. And what he did was set about breeding a new form of wheat. He set up research farms down by the coast and up in the mountains so that he could get 2 harvests a year, and doubling up the time that it took to crossbreed wheat. The Mexicans thought he was completely mad. He would cut off, he had a few workers who worked with him, he would cut off stamens by hand, he would pollinate the plants, he'd put little paper cups over them to make sure that, little paper sachets to make sure that they weren't cross-pollinated by other pollens. And in the end, he managed to create a very high-yielding wheat that was bred into a short Japanese stem, so that when the wind blew on these incredibly heavy heads, they didn't lodge, they didn't blow over, and you didn't lose your harvest. And that was also resistant to wheat rust. And then he took those seeds, because he knew that no one was going to trust the gringo, the crazy gringo who'd been marching around in the fields. And he sought out the most popular farmers, the farmers who everyone else looked up to, and he gave them samples of these seeds, and they grew these seeds, and they were hugely increased their yields. And by doing this, by 1960, by the time Borlaug left Mexico, having imported half its wheat, Mexico was fully self-sufficient in wheat. It was actually exporting wheat. And this experiment was repeated for rice and for maize across the world. And what we saw was what has, ironically in some ways, and we'll come on to that, be known as the Green Revolution, but this extraordinary change in the way we produce our food. So the population continued to grow as projected. We actually farm off slightly less land than we did back then. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of very marginal land that was cooperatized came out of production. But we produce a huge number of more calories. We actually produce now almost twice the number of calories for 8 billion people off slightly less land than we produced for 2.5 billion people. About 50% of the world's population, 40 to 50%, depending on what estimates you look at, wouldn't be able to live today if we stopped Borlaug's system, which was these plants, mixed with industrial nitrogen fertilizer created using the Haber-Bosch process, mixed with modern irrigation techniques, 50% of the planet wouldn't be able to be fed. But as happens when you solve just one thing, and the equation that Borlaug was trying to solve was, how do I get the most calories off a square meter of land? That was the equation. When you try and solve one thing, you often create unintended effects. And the first unintended effect was our farming system, the way that we farm, now completely dominates the environment. It is by far the biggest cause of biodiversity collapse. It is the biggest cause of deforestation. It's the biggest cause of water stress. It's the biggest cause of water pollution. It's the biggest cause of the collapse of aquatic life. And after energy production, it's the second biggest cause of climate change. One way of thinking about how much it has overtaken the ecosystem is to look at the total weight of people. This is in 10,000 BC, at the beginning of the Holocene, when there are 1 to 2 million people, and wild animals, and defined here as vertebrates and land-dwelling vertebrates and birds. And in the Holocene, obviously, the animals weigh quite a lot more than the people. If we fast forward this today, this is to the same scale. So we can see here our 8 billion people. We see here our wild animals very much reduced in weight and number, initially due to our enthusiastic hunting of megafauna, and then latterly due to industrial agricultural techniques. In fact, animals kept by humans as pets, well, horses, dogs, and cats, in the case of France, not always as pets, but horses, dogs, and cats now weigh almost as much as all wild animals. And the 80 billion animals that we rear, that we kill every year to feed us, now weigh twice as much at any one time as all the humans on the planet, and 20 times as much as all of the wild animals. Farming dominates our environment. And it's continuing, this destruction is continuing. This shows the picture just from 1970, so the Green Revolution was already well underway. We have continued to become better at producing more calories from that meter squared of land. This is UK wheat production in tons per hectare. It's doubled since 1970. And at the same time, our bird populations have halved. We've literally driven wildlife off our land. We have the worst, this is a bird index, we have the fewest birds on our farmland in the UK than any country in Europe. And probably the most frightening chart that we saw, and I think Dustin, who's sitting here, might have showed me this for the first time. This is a chart that's been produced by a number of people. I think this is the UN version, but NASA's done a version. And they've tried to look at what might happen to yields across the globe if you had a 2.5 degree temperature rise. And what they think would happen is that in the north, the wheat yields, the green areas, would go up because they have more carbon dioxide, which is their food, and the atmosphere is warmer. So we would see an increase in wheat yields on the great fields of Canada, in Russia, and Ukraine, in the UK. But in the equatorial zones and the south, rice and maize yields would go down. And I think this was the single most frightening chart that I saw in the whole time we did the food strategy. Because what this looks like is starvation, war, and mass migration. And in fact, you could say that the food system, the food we eat and the way we produce it, is imperiling the way we produce our food. The way we produce our food is going to end up with us not being able to feed ourselves on a global level. And it's not just our environment that's a problem. So it's also a disaster for our health. This shows the number of years lost to ill health and to ill health and death by factor for non-communicable diseases. And food, all of the purple ones are food. It is by far the largest cause now, way exceeding smoking or alcohol, of non-communicable ill health. It kills, on average, every year in this country, slightly fewer people than were killed in the worst COVID year, right around the same number. And we know what governments would do now to stop that happening. Yet this happens every year, year after year. And it is concentrated on people. It is pervasive across society, but it's concentrated on the least affluent. This chart shows, from left to right on each of the charts, the least affluent 10% of postcodes to the most affluent. And preventable mortality, heart disease, cancer, childhood overweight and obesity, dental decay, are all visited in a more concentrated fashion on people who are living in poverty. And if you want a kind of anecdotal way of understanding this, the NHS now thinks that type 2 diabetes alone, which is just one form of diet-related disease, is going to cost it, by 2035, more than treating all cancers do today. Chris Whitty, who was not one of the, who was probably one of the busier people during lockdown, did an online lecture on the damage that diet-related disease was doing to the NHS. It is, and more recently, Andy Haldane, who was until recently, the chief economist at the Bank of England, so not a kind of left-wing firebrand, said that he believes that non-communicable disease, this disease, is going to be the biggest drag on our economy. So what that looks like is the NHS, because we can't let that go down, sucks in money from the rest of the state. Meanwhile, our GDP and tax takes stagnate or go down, and we end up both sick and impoverished. When we asked, one of the great things, normally I say, has anyone in this room ever done an independent review for government? And no one puts up their hand, but I'm not going to ask it here because there'll be a huge... but if you ever get asked to do it, take the opportunity, because one of the most extraordinary things you can do is you can ring up anyone in the world with a government backing who knows about stuff and get them to explain how things work. And in fact, you can get the two cleverest people in the world with different views and get them arguing now on a Zoom. And that is fantastic. And the first thing that we did when we looked at how do we think about this was ask people, this is such a complex problem, how should we think about it? And almost everyone we asked said, well, you have to take a systems approach. And we said, well, what does that mean? And we got different responses. And one of the responses we got was we were sent, quite often, we were shown this chart. This chart is quite famous in obesity circles, so there is such a thing as obesity circles. And it's called the Foresight Obesity Chart. And it does map out all of the different ways in which our environment, our genes, combine to conspire to help us put on weight. So whether that is mental health, where you live, how rich you are, all of those things. Social, psychological, economic, food, etc. And it is, when I first, I don't know if any of you have seen, if you Google spiders on drugs, it's probably done in Oxford, maybe in Cambridge, there's a research group that gave spiders different drugs and made them make webs. And so if you give a spider acid, it makes a kind of crazy fractal web. And if you give it speed, it makes its web very fast. And if you give it dope, it just sits back and doesn't make its web. And this always struck me as being like one of the... By the way, this is true, and I strongly recommend when you've got not much time, that you Google spiders on drugs. Brilliant. But this is what this reminded me of. It's helpful in that it tells you it's complicated, but it's deeply unhelpful when you're trying to get change in government, because they'll look at it and think, well, it's too hard. I'll do something else. I'll stop the boats. So that was one chart we were shown. Another chart was this chart, which is actually a terrific chart. It's done by Kelly Parsons, who researches food policy in London, and it shows all of the different government departments and how responsibility for food is spread over them like a thin layer of honey on toast. So every government department has some area where it is responsible for food. And this is a problem. So for example, if you look at the advertising ban, which is one of the most popular policies to ban advertising of junk food to children or online, very publicly popular, has been kicked down the can repeatedly now till 2025, Boris Johnson having said he'd do it. When we were discussing it, and I saw this as the lead non-exec at DEFRA, what would happen would be Department for Culture, Media and Sport, who had ITV in their ear, and I describe ITV lobbying me on this, would say, oh, well, advertising doesn't work, first of all. So I've always thought it was a strange argument. And then secondly, if you do this, you won't have any kids programs, because this is what funds kids programs. And then you'd have DEFRA saying, well, you know, the food companies say this is going to really hurt their profits, you know, it'll hurt GDP. And then you have poor old Department for Health trying to mop up, saying, look, we cannot continue to mop up the mess. And in order to resolve this, you need to have a strong, steady number 10. And in the time that I was at DEFRA, I had 5 secretaries of states, 4 prime ministers, 4 marching up hills to Brexit and then back down again, no deal Brexit, a war and COVID. So it was not possible to get anything kind of seriously systemic done. But it is difficult, this. It is a problem, but it is not what is causing the problems. It makes it harder to solve. So we talked to more and more people, and in the end, we got a number of people who said, look at the kind of the science of system dynamics. And Ian Boyd, who was at the time was the lead, Gideon Henderson, his predecessor, so chief scientific advisor at DEFRA, said it's interesting, system dynamics, one of the few areas of science that's come from business, and now all of us biologists. Ian studies energy distribution in ecosystems, how energy is redistributed in ecosystems. And basically you look at the feedback loops that are in the ecosystem, how they affect each other, and all of these complex systems, whatever they are, whether it's in our body, in a lake, in a supermarket, they all have certain things in common in the way that they fail and the way their feedback loops work. And so if you're trying to talk to government, you have to create a minimum viable description of the system and really focus on what are the feedback loops you need to fix to make them work. And we chose 2 feedback loops. The first, and I said everything people believed about the food system was wrong. This is an example. So this was when the advertising ban was kicked down the road last. This is what the Sun said. How about applying the same common sense to other failed measures like the sugar tax, which won't trim an ounce off anyone's weight, then concentrate on the real solutions, better education on diet and exercise. Now this is provably wrong. So if you ask people what they should be eating, they know. They may have skills problems, but they know what they should be eating. 97% of people or something can describe what a good diet does. And we know that exercise is fantastic for all sorts of things, but for various reasons that we can go into the Q&A if you want, it's pretty lousy for helping you lose weight. And yet this is what even people who, in fact, particularly people who are sick because of food think. They think it is my own fault because I do not have the willpower and I haven't exercised, and they blame themselves. And it just simply is not true. In 1950, under 1% of the population was obese. Now 28% was. We haven't had a mass collapse in willpower. What has happened is that we have a junk food cycle. We have what is known as a reinforcing feedback loop. A bit like you and me shouting at each other, and we shout in an argument louder and louder. I shout louder, you shout louder, we reinforce. And what's happening is that our appetite makes us seek out and gives us particular pleasure from food that was hard to find, high in calories, calorie dense, which when it is low in water and low in soluble fiber, gives us enormous pleasure and fills us up much less quickly, so we eat a lot of it. And what has happened is that companies have spotted this. Not surprisingly, they spend more and more of their money marketing this stuff. We eat more, they spend more, we eat more, they spend more, and we get sick. And an example, just one example of this is the market for fruit and veg and confectionery in the UK every year. So we spend 2.2 billion on fresh fruit and veg and 3.9 billion, just one kind of this bad food, is what we spend on it. It's completely dominated our diets. 85% of the food that is sold by the big processed food companies is deemed by the World Health Organization to be too unhealthy to market to children. And you are not going to solve this through education and exercise. You need to attack the commercial incentives of those companies. Or, and we might talk about this later, which is what I think is going to happen, you attack the appetite. So the alternative to attacking the commercial incentives of companies is that you take appetite-suppressing drugs, of which semaglutide, Wegovy, Ozempic, you might have heard of, is the first one, and you drug people. And at the moment, the government is looking at how much it would cost to drug 12 million people out of obesity. I think it's quite likely that you might see a third of the population on appetite-suppressant drugs because no one has the balls to actually deal with the root cause of the problem. The other feedback loop that's going wrong, well, there's an absence of feedback loop, was identified by Partha Dasgupta in his incredible Economics of Biodiversity, a review for Treasury. I'm sorry to say that the version it's 600 pages long, and he strongly resisted any summaries because he said that's the 600 pages, that's what it is. And they did summarize it, they forced him to summarize it, but it's not as good. You have to read the 600-page one, which is brilliant, but it's quite long. Anyway, so he pointed out that nature is literally invisible often. It's silent, it's invisible, it's mobile, it's hard to measure, it's hard to quantify. But also, in any measure of human success, it is invisible. You can't count it in your wallet. You can't look at it on the balance sheet of a company. It's not in the way that we measure GDP. And in fact, it's worse than that. So Dasgupta estimates that governments worldwide subsidize the destruction of nature to the tune of $500 billion a year. So we pay subsidies to fishing companies, to intensive agriculture, to fossil fuel companies, and those $500 billion of subsidies cause $4 to $6 trillion of damage to nature. We're giving nature a negative value. We're not just not measuring it, we're paying people to destroy nature. So we talked a little bit about what you do to tackle the junk food cycle. You have to either tackle the commercial incentives of companies or you have to tackle the appetite. What do you do about nature? Well, the first thing that you have to realize is that through the course of human history, pretty much up until the late 18th century, say, we got everything we wanted from the falling of sunlight on the soil. We made our clothes from crops, our food, our building materials, everything we got from the soil and from the sun. And then we discovered millions and millions and millions of years of stored sunlight in the form of fossil fuels. And suddenly, our land, at about the same time, in time for that green revolution, got freed up because we didn't need our land for all of those uses. We've now realized that we cannot use that stored up sunlight anymore. And also we've realized that we need that biodiversity. So you're solving a different equation. Instead of solving food per meter squared, you're solving nutrition per meter squared, plus you need your land to be carbon negative, you need it to suck up some of the emissions from other sectors, and you need it to restore nature. And the question that we ask then is that possible? Can you solve it? It's a simultaneous equation. Can you solve it? And the answer is you can solve it. This chart on the left here shows the areas that are in red are the areas, and I'm again indebted to Dustin for this work. If you want to come up and present this bit, Dustin, you're welcome to do it. So the areas in red show the areas in our country which are suited both to restoring biodiversity and sequestering carbon. A lot of peatland, a lot of uplands, and some land around the New Forest. And the good news is that there is an overlap between that land and the land that produces food. So 20% of our land produces only 3% of our calories. So if you can incentivize people to farm in the right places and restore nature in the right places, you can solve this equation. But it's not obvious, and actually you need to have, we have a natural life in this country that evolved both on farm, because we've been farming for so long, and off farm. So we call it the three-compartment model. It's more of a continuum. You need some land to be completely unfarmed or farmed at very, very low densities. Some land to be farmed in an agroecological way, where you intentionally reduce your yields to have nature and food living on the same land, because there's a whole ecosystem that has evolved to do that. And then you have some areas of land which are more intensively farmed, so you might have monocrops, but done so in a way that doesn't have the inputs. So you have these different levels. sustainable but more intense yields, lower yields with more nature, and wild, unfarmed areas. And you can have it all if you do three things. You reduce waste, as we know it, the kind of waste everyone talks about, but you also reduce waste in terms of more efficient farming. So if you look at farms across the UK, they have incredible variation, even the same kind of farm, of efficiency, and often actually the least efficient are the most environmentally destructive. So we have a huge training program that we need to do. And then finally, we need to reduce another kind of waste, and that is the incredibly inefficient use of land for rearing meat. So this chart here shows the proportion of our land that is used to do different things. We actually feed ourselves from almost twice the area of land that we have in the UK, because we get a lot of meat and feed and vegetables from other countries. And what you'll notice here is that the green areas are areas of land that are either used to graze animals or to produce feed. The yellow areas are poultry feed or poultry areas, and the blue is pig feed. And if you add all of those together, 85% of the land that we use to feed ourselves is used to create meat. And it's just inefficient. We don't need to become vegans, but we need significantly to reduce the amount of wheat we need, not primarily to reduce methane emissions, although that's important, but to give us some of that land back. So, just to kind of wrap up, we then put this all together. We said, well, at a high level, what would that look like in terms of targets? And basically, for health and environment, we need to eat about 30% more fruit and veg, about 50% more fiber, 25% less junk food, and 30% less meat to hit our 2030 targets. And how would you do that? We put in place a bunch of policies under 4 strategic imperatives. So one was escaping the junk food cycle. So how do you restrict advertising? We put in place recommended a sugar and salt reformulation tax, and you take some of that money to support the diet of those who are living in poverty. At the moment, our food is artificially cheap because it is these basically refined carbohydrates, refined oil, refined sugar, produced using the Green Revolution methods. It is wildly unsustainable and unhealthy, and it is basically our solution to poverty at the moment, is unsustainable food. That is not a long-term sustainable thing, but while we have the inequality we do, let's use some of that money to support the diets of those who are less well off through extending free school meals, through extending Healthy Start programs, and actually there's some really interesting fruit and veg, actually giving fruit and veg to people living in poverty. There's a program in Washington, there's a program near me in Hackney. It's got incredible results and really popular, more popular than just being given the money, and the results in terms of 5 a day, children going from 7% 5 a day to 70% 5 a day. So there are lots of stuff we can do there. The third thing is make the best use of our land, and this is about, let's look at that land on the previous chart and think about, create a land use framework. Think about actually what it is we need to do with the different kinds of land that we have, so that as we take the £3.4 billion that we used to spend through the Common Agricultural Policy, and we spend that in different ways, we do that cognizant of what effects that we want it to achieve. And then finally, create a long-term shift in our food culture. This one, people often go, you're nuts. That's never going to happen. And in my dark moments, I think that too, but I also think it has happened. So in this country, we completely changed our food culture when we moved a huge amount of our population into the cities for the worse, through the Industrial Revolution. We had this, France didn't have the same concentration of people in its cities that we had in the late 19th century until 1960. So we had this very early concentration of populations in our cities. We then realized during the Boer War that they were weaklings, and so we introduced free school meals. Government is constantly trying to change food cultures. In Japan, if you look at the food culture there, and we talk about this in the book, we think of that as a completely kind of God-given wonderful food culture. it was actually created through huge amounts of government intervention. First of all, when they opened up in the late 19th century, the Meiji Restoration, and the emperor saw that all these huge Chinese and Dutch people coming to visit. The Dutch were the only people who would step on the Bible to swear, so they let the Dutch do business with them because they were very suspicious of Christians, but the Dutch were always pragmatists. And they came in, these huge foreigners, and the emperor thought, shit, we're going to have to do something about that. So he then himself started eating red meat, which was taboo, and publicized this. He got doctors in the army to steal recipes from around the world. Katsu curry was stolen from British naval boats. It's a British recipe based on our colony in India. He then got the cooks in the army to do radio shows to change the diet. And then after the war again, MacArthur and the Americans faced another problem of malnutrition, and they created things like, I don't know if any of you tried delicious Japanese mayonnaise. It's got twice the amount of eggs because they wanted to get more protein into the population. So the Japanese diet as we know it didn't really start until the 1960s, early 1970s. And even now, it is massively affected by the state. Farming is very controlled, it's a problem for food security, but to create national products, planning restrictions are very tight, so you don't get as many fast food shops, et cetera, So we can change the culture. What I'd kind of end by saying to you, I'm not going to talk about The Wizard and the Prophet, but this is another very good book on food, if you want to see. Actually, I might talk about it in a second. I'll talk about it now. So, we need two things. The first is we need to change the conversation, and actually, I think through the food strategy, we saw the way in which the discussion has become polarized. And one of the things that I read while working on this was this extraordinary book by Charles C. Mann, The Wizard and the Prophet, which follows Norman Borlaug's life, and also an environmentalist called John Voight. And they were living at the same time, and one of them had Voight had a spiritual belief in nature, and that nature would solve everything, and what was causing all of the trouble was scientists and modern human techniques. And Borlaug's view was, the population is growing, we need science, we need to double down on science. And what Charles C. Mann writes in his book, he says, both men are dead now, but their disciples continue the hostilities between them. Indeed, the dispute between wizards and prophets has, if anything, become more vehement. Wizards view the prophet's emphasis on cutting back as intellectually dishonest, indifferent to the poor, even racist, because most of the world's hungry and non-Caucasian. Following Voight, they say, is a path towards regression, narrowness, and global poverty. Prophets, on the other hand, sneer that the wizard's faith in human resourcefulness is unthinking, scientifically ignorant, even driven by greed, because remaining within ecological limits will cut into corporate profits. Following Borlaug, they say, at best postpones an inevitable day of reckoning. It is a recipe for what activists have become to describe as ecocides. As the name-calling has escalated, conversations about the environment have increasingly become dialogues of the deaf, which might be all right if we weren't discussing the fate of our children. And one of the things I think we need in this debate is what we're seeing, actually, lucky now, thanks in large part due to huge computing power, is for the first time a slight alignment between the wizards and the prophets. So, for example, soil science, which is something that the prophets have talked about, well, since before Silent Spring, way back, is now suddenly the Borlaug people think, oh, maybe we shouldn't just be pumping nitrogen onto things, maybe we should be building this stuff called soil. I think that actually, the more computer science expands, the more we're going to see a coming together of the wizards and the prophets, which I think is a fantastic thing. And then I'll finish just by saying, what can you do? What can we all do? And I think that, you create change, you do need to have top-down interventions. You need to break these feedback loops, or in the case of the invisibility of nature, introduce the feedback loop. And you need government to do that. Government is the only body that can do that. But that is only necessary and almost never sufficient. Every plate, I have a charity that works in schools, improving the cooking and the food education in schools. And there are all sorts of rules about what you should do in schools. And I go and visit schools all the time, and some of the food is terrible, and some of the food is great. And what's the difference? The difference is because in those schools where it's great, someone cared. Someone decided to make a difference. And every plate of food, delicious, nutritious food that's ever been put in front of another human being is there because someone had the care, the love to do that. And so we start the book by saying, we're in the, when you put a forkful of food to your mouth, you may think that you are a free acting individual. Actually, you're a tiny cog in a machine, and a lot of your decisions are not as free-willed as you might think they are. But we end the book by saying, because you're a cog in the machine, you can move the machine. So I would encourage each of you, if you're not involved in the top-down stuff, just to look at your local community and think of just one thing you can do to improve the system a bit, to make it a little bit better. And that might involve, if you've got grandchildren or children, going to their school and eating lunch with them, which is, at primary school, it's absolutely fantastic. It's like a kind of, like a regal visit. In secondary school, they're a little less keen. But often that has been the moment, that has been the trigger that has got a school to change, that made them realize it's bad. It might be eating a third less meat in your house. It might be going and helping with the local food bank. It might be teaching your godchildren to cook. But just think of one thing, because if we can get the government, as I think they will in the end, to do the top-down thing, we need a whole army of people making the change from the bottom up. Thank you very much.
Henry, that was fabulous. Many thanks indeed. And we've got a good time for questions. If I can just remind the audience, we do record this and it's broadcast, so just bear that in mind when you ask a question. And
if you're not here with your partner,
precisely.
Your partner, yes.
And if you could wait until the microphone gets to you. Now, I'm going to abuse my position by asking the first question. And to ask you, Henry, just to reflect on how the National Food Strategy landed, the response of government, and then looking ahead, how you think it may influence the debate and policy, perhaps beyond the current government.
So I think what's interesting is, I think that if I separate those things into, as I did kind of at the beginning, into policies and ideas, on the policy side, they've probably done just under a half by number of the policies. Some of them forced Marcus Rashford campaign for some of the food poverty things, and they got in. But I think, on the environmental side, they are, I'm not sure they get it right, but they're doing the land use framework, they're doing a bunch of stuff. They've gone backwards on health. So they've actually, when we published, we didn't put in restricting advertising as an action because they'd said they'd do it. They've now kicked it down the road. But, I'd done the school food strategy in the past. I knew what I was getting myself into. I would have taken that. If you'd said that, I would have taken it. Where I think it's more exciting is on the ideas side, and this isn't just because of our work, but there is been a stream of things from Partha, ours, and I really think the ideas about the invisibility of nature are now fully embedded, and there is all sorts of fights which we're going to get more and more ferocious between farmers and government and environmental NGOs, but at least they're about how we do the right thing. The NFU has tried to bring back in the idea of being paid for food, and they've been knocked back. We'll see what happens with this food summit that Rishi Sunak's having on Monday. But I think in the environmental side, the ideas are pretty set. In the health side, the junk food cycle, I think, has really landed. And I think it's very difficult in government now to make the argument that it's about education and exercise. And since the book has been published, interestingly, which kind of validates the reason to a book, I've been invited back into Number 10 to talk about it. I've been invited by Labour. I think everyone now has really grasped that in 10 years' time, whichever government is in power, if they haven't addressed the health issues, they're going to be facing a world of hurt. So I think I feel that we're just at the peak, at the kind of moment of breaking through on health. I mean, there's a huge way to go from that to policy, but as I said at the beginning, if they don't understand the ideas, you're not going to get the policy.
Thank you. Let me go to the audience for a question. At the back there on the right.
Thank you for a really exciting and interesting talk. You talked about changing the culture, and last month, the People's Plan for Nature that was published by the National Trust, RSPB and WWF called for a national conversation about how we change our diet. How would you see people in schools, community groups, councils, wherever, actually helping make that shift in culture happen?
So first of all, I think, just to note, I think the new, slightly angrier versions of the RSPB, National Trust and WWF are to be welcomed. I think they're doing a huge amount of good work at the moment on the nature side, and it's great to see people who, in the case of Natural Trust, own a lot of land, but also those organisations realise they can't just sit back and talk to the crowd. They've got to get out there, so that's fantastic. The thing, if anyone were to ask me, and what I've done in the communities that I live in, and funny enough, what we did in the National Food Strategy at a national and then a local level, the single thing you can do at a local level to change your food culture is really simple. It's to get a group of people together and work out what you want to do. So, for example, in Dartmouth, which is an area that I spend a lot of time in, we're getting together with the local school, with the local GPs, with the supermarket owner. I'm going to sit down and we're going to say, okay, what are we going to do to change the culture in our local area? And so I think the precursor to changing culture, which is largely local thing, I could talk about some of the things the government could do, but it happens a lot locally, is to get people talking about it and coming up with what needs to change in their area of expertise.
Thank you. Clara, there's a question towards the back there.
Further to the last comment, I have a niece in deepest Suffolk, and she has taken the children at primary school, which is a parent, not a teacher. She gets them to grow food, vegetables mostly, and to cook them. I think this is a bottom-up way of approaching what you're talking about.
Yes, and guessing if I have had, my children have had some very interesting eating journeys, shall we say, from restrictive to one went vegetarian, then came back. Johnny just ate meat and fruit for about 3 years, like some kind of hedge fund billionaire. And the one thing you can do to get children trying food more is to grow it. A child will try anything they've grown. I think that, funny enough, Prince Charles, had wanted to get a farm in every school, which was quite ambitious. But although with Shefton Schools, we're putting a farm into a school in Tooting, so they're not necessarily completely ambitious. But I do think that allowing children to see how food grows and then to cook it themselves as well is one of the biggest things you can do to change what they eat.
There's a lady with a purple jumper, I think, there, if I've seen right. Just a bit further forward.
Further forward.
There we go.
Oh, sorry. Hello, 2 quick comments. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, you mentioned that agroecological farming often has a lower yield, and I just wanted to hear what you thought around the amount of data that's currently coming from agroecological farmers and if the government is supporting adequate data collection, because for example, at the moment, we know that smallholder farmers, and most of those will be agroecological, don't even get the CAP, or they weren't getting the Common Agricultural Policy. Some of them are unlikely to get ELM, so the Environmental Land Management. So how can we make sure that data is being collected and that funding is supporting those farmers to be able to reach the yields that the bigger farmers that have had consistent support from subsidies have been able to achieve? So that's a fair playing field for being able to, And then my other comment was just around diversity of diet. So you showed that wheat map, which looked scary, but obviously not everyone uses wheat as their base kind of grain. So it would be interesting to hear if you think there's any good mapping out there that kind of shows what dietary diversity could do, and also if you reverted to pre-colonial dietary diversity, so what people were eating before perhaps they were maybe started to grow rice in areas where they were growing millet, for example, in North India, and again, how globalization has impacted dietary diversity. So, sorry, yeah, the other point on that was around mapping dietary diversity specific to kind of food sovereignty or original diets or indigenous diets. Thanks.
So I'm going to take those as two things. So on the data, if you want to create a land use framework, i.e. you want to think about seriously how you incentivize people, you need the data at quite a discrete level to be able to do that. And funny enough, it was Patrick, I was trying to work out how to make this point, and Patrick Vallance pointed me to something that Kofi Annan had said about malnutrition in Africa, and how they only started to deal with it. They created a digital map of Africa which showed almost at a village level where malnutrition was hitting. And it was only when they got that data, it did two things. First of all, it created impetus because you could see it, but also it enabled much more careful intervention. DEFRA have said they're going to do that. They're going to create this data partnership, but I have no idea whether or not that's going to happen or not. But you need that to get it right. And then, yes, I mean, the Western diet effect, I mean, that was rice and maize as well, so the Southern Hemisphere rice and maize. But yes, fundamentally, the problem is that we now all eat refined wheat, sugar, and vegetable oil in the Western diet, and that is a fundamental problem. I mean, at the moment, I think that you'll see, if you look at, there's a fantastic chapter in Chris Van Tulleken's book, Ultra-Processed People, about Nestle, the huge extent Nestle went to spread their products in the Amazon, like setting up shop, going up I mean, just really terrifying. And that is a huge problem. You know, that diet is not healthy.
I'm going to take a question from the web, and people joining us online, do feel free to ask questions. Can you speak a little, this is from Constantine Bourne, can you speak a little about what role alternative protein production will need to play, and how can this sector be supported through policy, if you believe it should be? So
there's someone in the audience here who's actually fed me a lab-grown meatball, and I'm still here. It's delicious. It tasted of pork, which is what it was grown from, pork stem cells. So I think there's a kind of dual transition. We need, at the moment, 50% of the meat that we eat is eaten in processed food and mince. A lot of the dairy we eat, most of the dairy that China imports from New Zealand is imported in the form of milk powder. And I think that alternative proteins are going to be, as soon as they become cheaper than the processed form, I actually think, Rich may not thank me for saying this, I think that cultured meat, there are a lot of people who are not richer than me who invest in it, but it seems to me it's going to be always at the more expensive end. But I certainly think improving the flavor of plant proteins, fermented precision fermentation, as soon as you can ferment milk powder, cheapen the milk powder, why on earth put it through a cow, a methane-producing cow, huge, heavy ruminant, incredibly inefficient, hot-blooded, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is going to happen, and it's going to be an important part of the transition. What people worry about that is they say, well, that's not very healthy. And the answer is, no, it's not necessarily healthy, but it's because you're taking the unhealthy food and you're putting it into the unhealthy food. But let's at least use that fact to solve a big part of the environmental problem. And so I'm a big fan. In terms of government, how government can be involved, I think we've got it wrong in this country. So if you look at Canada or America, they have the companies very closely situated with the regulators and with the academics, and they are looking ahead, not just to support them financially, but also to understand the regulatory environment, how they can make it easier for those companies. My worry in this country is that there is a huge opportunity and everyone's just going to move. Everyone's going to go to America, and we'll get all our stuff from America or Canada. And we've got some of the best scientists in the world doing this, and I think that they are going to leave these shores if we don't get our act in gear.
Gideon.
Thank you. I'll avoid any of the policy implications of what you're talking about. But, well, first of all, you started off by saying no one downloads the government reports. I would just like to reassure you, I've seen the very distinctive blue spine of your report in a lot of surprising places, and it's often very well thumbed, and the spine is thoroughly broken. So I think it is being very well read and influential. I had a question. I mean, a lot of what you said today was talking about the need for cultural change, and of course, cultural change is very hard. I agree with you that we need it, but it's hard to realise. Not just consumers, but the people producing the food as well. Getting the system to change is hard. And the example you started with of Borlaug, he was kind of a wizard working with the grain of the people and improving the food that they were already eating. I just wondered how much of a role you think there is for the wizards in the solution. You've just talked about it a little bit with alternative proteins. There's lots of other scientific ways which we might improve the food system. Use of gene editing for crop production, vertical farming, feed additives to reduce methane emissions, the list is long. How much do you think we might be able to rely on some of those wizard solutions as well as the cultural change that clearly we do need?
I think it's huge. I mean, first of all, for the land that I talked about, we need, if we're going to feed everyone, as well as eating less meat, we need that third compartment. You cannot make it work unless you have some land producing food at very high yields, which at the moment you can't do agroecologically. You could just about do it if you went to a system that was very cattle heavy and you had a huge shift in diet, but it would be very carbon producing. And so if you look at what's happening now, just like I'm most excited by big data and AI. So I'm most excited. It started off with, Sector Mentor, people working out they didn't need to put nitrogen on every plant. They could do it in bits of their field, and they could work out which bits of their field needed potash, which plants were struggling. That, I think, is very soon going to develop onto almost a per plant basis, where already you have fields where you can identify, drones that can identify every plant in the field. That will massively reduce inputs, become much more productive. If you look at vertical farms, so if I think of myself, for example, in Egypt, rather than, we tend to think of ourselves in the UK. In Egypt, you're living in a country with a huge amount of sun and enough food, enough land, if you're lucky, to feed about half your population. Most of your grain comes from the UK and Russia. Over 40% of your population are living on the starvation line, and your population is going to grow double over the next 50 years. It strikes me that there is no doubt in my mind that as vertical farming becomes more productive, precision fermentation becomes more productive, that those countries will become the bread basket, will use this food. And actually, you can see a time when Morocco, for example, if we get solar power up to where it needs to be, becomes one of the fertilizer producing hubs of the world, because you'll be able to make fertilizer not using electric energy or gas, but using sunlight. So I think that those technologies, you have to have, the whole point of that Charles Human was making is you need both. You cannot either be purely spiritual and reject science, or reject deep knowledge that's been grown up. And the problem with actually what went on with Borlaug is that they didn't really understand system science. They thought, okay, we'll just put in nitrogen and they didn't think at the time that might cause huge problems, but it has done.
We do have lots of questions, so if I can ask questioners to be as brief as possible.
Yes, the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I'm a great fan of your book now, but you haven't in either of those talked about the possibility of better use of marine resources.
Thank you.
And I think a lot of people would say better marine husbandry might be an additional solution.
Thank you.
You're absolutely right. The great weakness of both the food strategy, I think we admitted it explicitly, both the food strategy and the book, was that it doesn't deal with marine. And I think there are two things that are going to happen over the next 5 years. I think you're going to see much more of this. One is we're going to realize that it's not, I think that so-called blue carbon, I think we're going to realize that more and more evidence that I see suggests that bottom trawling is releasing a huge amount of carbon as well as destroying ecosystems. And because we don't see it, I think that is going to become a huge issue. But we kind of touch a little bit on some of the marine technologies and ways of growing food and aquaculture and seaweed and stuff. But I think that will also be a huge area for of growth. I worry a lot. Again, I spend a lot of time in Dartmouth. I spend a lot of time in Brixham, and I think, in the same way that in the book we use the example of when cars replaced horses. In 10 years in America, a whole slew of industries that had been around for thousands of years, wheelwrights, carriage makers, fodder growers, just all disappeared overnight. And I do worry about our fishing communities, because I increasingly think that the way in which we fish at the moment is just completely unsustainable. And when you overlay the carbon as well as the biodiversity element, I think those communities are going to have to find another way of making a living, is my guess.
I'm going to take a question from the online, from Alex Cheaton. And Alex, forgive me, I'm going to shorten it. What's the role of the planning system in having better food outcomes?
So again, back to Kelly Parsons' diagram, planning is critical in a number of ways, and sometimes quite unexpected. So if you look at the upland, say the Lake District, and you look at that, if you're an upland sheep farmer, we cannot use that land to grow sheep. It's not a good use of that land. We need more biodiversity, we need more carbon sequestration. That means you need other sources of revenue. That means we need to be encouraging more recreation on that land. If you look at Cumbria at the moment, all the tourists are at Windermere. It's kind of, Windermere's like Piccadilly Circus, and you've got these kind of massive bleak areas. We need more places where you can go to walk, to enjoy nature, build things, and at the moment planning is restricting all of that. So we need to find a clever way of allowing good planning in landscapes that we've seen as pristine, but actually are not pristine at all. So that's one way. And then at a local level, it strikes me that, looking at how you restrict what is near schools, all of that stuff, how you manage high streets is another way in which people have used planning. So I think planning is at the moment, I don't think it's realised quite how much planning is at the centre of the farming agricultural transition, but it's also at the centre of a number of other things as well.
Thank you. Question here.
Hello. Thank you very much for a very empowering talk. Can I ask about your thoughts and ideas on insects playing a part in our cultural shift, in the food chain shift that we need to have to move forwards?
So I was lucky enough to go to Ferra, which used to be a government facility, has now been spun off. And one of the experiments they're doing is trying to work out how they can use flies to process waste, manure, food waste, etc., in the most efficient way possible. And they have these huge nets full of flies, and they're constantly feeding them different kinds of things and measuring how big they grow. And I think that probably will be quite a big thing. I doubt it will be for human consumption initially, but if you think about chicken feed and all of those kind of things, if you can turn waste into food to feed to animals in the first instance, evolution has created just so many extraordinary machines that are so much more efficient at doing things, that this is back to the wizard and the prophet thing, so much more efficient at doing things than we ever would be. And there are a lot of insects that are much more efficient at converting things into protein than we're ever going to work out in my lifetime. So yes, I think they will be part of the solution.
Thank you. Wanted to go to the back, and there was someone waving at me. May you stop? We'll go to Clara. Just pick someone from the back there. He's got the microphone. Please give us your question.
Excellent talk, thank you. Have you looked at mental health, particularly that of our young people, as a case for catalysing more urgent change? And I'm thinking, for example, the role of increasing fibre diversity on the gut microbiome, which generates so many neurochemicals, the omega-6, omega-3 balance, and the lack of micronutrients in the processed foods that so many of our young people eat.
So we did, but probably not enough. We decided, there's a whole bunch of arguments around eating disorders, which we put out of scope because we class them as mental health problems. But I think, as you say, the role of UPF, or processed foods, in inflammation, and how inflammation plays out in mental health as well as other forms of health, is going to be a big deal. But no, we didn't really, we probably could have done more on that.
Thank you. We have a question at the back.
Thanks. Henry, can I just take you back to your land use map of Britain that had that sort of big chunk of green in the middle that you said was used very inefficiently for livestock farming? And then can I then take you to your 3 compartments of what you think farming should look like in the future? Isn't that your middle compartment where you're getting really good biodiversity outcomes, you're not farming the land really hard, but you're getting some produce off it and you're getting some biodiversity dividends as well?
Absolutely. So that's, and in fact, you might have some livestock, even in, so if you look at what people call sustainable intensification, where you're cover cropping, people are now increasingly using sheep to take off the cover crop rather than glyphosate. And in agroecological farms, where you have very rich habitats, livestock are used in rotation. So absolutely, that's part of the solution. It's just not as much, not as much meat. So we just produce a huge amount of meat, and a lot of meat that we eat now is not grown like that. It's either reared indoors and fed, and even some of, so you can see it if once you get used to it, and you look at those kind of bright green fields that are slathered in nitrogen and actually pretty intensive grazing. So absolutely, I think the animals are going to be central to the solution, but we need fewer.
Helen.
You didn't say anything about food security, self-sufficiency, which is often played as a trump card in all sorts of policy debates. I just wondered how you have thought about that in the strategy.
So the way, so we first of all just kind of said, what do you mean by food security? And there was a paper that we pulled out that found 200 different definitions of what food security means. And at one extreme, there is self-sufficiency, which is you can produce everything in your country within your bounds to feed yourself. And that is actually not very secure, because if you have a harvest failure, you don't have the supply chain set up to bring food in from elsewhere. And then you kind of have varying different levels. One of the kind of, so the question is, what is the government's role in doing this? Is the government's role to make sure you can get an avocado on Christmas Day, or is it something else? And the answer is the government's role, and the role of all governments, has been to provide enough food so that they stay in power. And that is why food security has been on the agenda of all governments ever. From, it was one of the 3 items discussed in Athens, every meeting in the forum in Athens. Food security was interesting. Their way of doing food security, it was privatized, but they got most of their food from the Black Sea, and the state provided the army to protect the traders bringing the food up and down. Anyway, in the case of the UK, as discussed previously, we do not have anything like the food security problems of someone like Egypt. Our food, are miles away from that. And we conclude, if you look, we produce about 60% of what we produce. You can make the transition to ELS because you've got this 20% of land that produces 3% of calories. It is not the case that going wilder is suddenly going to make us food insecure. That's an NFU argument point. It's not true. And so we made the view that you should keep an eye on the 60%. And, if that begins to fall, you may think about what point you want to try and reverse it, but that we are so far off that kind of food security. Our food security problems are price problems, which is not about how much we grow, it's about inequality. And then shortages which make people panic, which again, we have never been. If you look at how we have survived through COVID in Ukraine, to huge blows to our food system, food price was a problem. We never had a calorie shortage of food. So I'm not as worried about our food security as people. But I do worry. I think the intent behind your question might have been, is it being used to further the arguments of vested interests? Yes, absolutely it is, yeah.
Thank you. A question over there, which I fear is going to be our last.
You said that one of the ways that people can make an individual difference is, for instance, helping at a food bank. I do volunteer in a food distribution group. I won't talk about how it's getting harder. I think most people know that, but a lot of the food that we get is based on donations or from organisations that get them as donations. Healthy food is limited. The kinds of food that we get are limited. How can we try and change those systems of, well, getting food out to people who already need support, but who are not necessarily getting food that they want or food that is fit for purpose?
So I think food insecurity has doubled almost in this cost of living crisis. And I think that in the past, food banks have provided a useful safety valve, often combining the fact that you've got food there to provide other services, housing advice, dealing with domestic abuse, etc., etc. But at the moment, I think the government needs to do more. It needs to expand universal credit. It needs to expand free school meals. I think it should really seriously look at accelerate. They've got a trial that they're doing on fruit and veg prescribing. I think they should accelerate that. So I don't think it's at a stage now where it's got beyond being a sticking plaster in the places where it's quite difficult for government to reach, where it's everywhere. Before I came here, I was at a food distribution centre in Summertown. There are 265 charities in the Oxford area that are distributing food to people who are in trouble. So, and the answer is, to your question, how do you do it better? I don't know. I know a lot of people I can put you in touch with, give me your email, who think about it a lot, but they will know better than me about how you deal with all of those issues. At the moment, everyone's buying their food. They used to use waste food. Everyone's just buying food for food banks. It's becoming the DWP kind of extension. It's terrible.
There are a lot of questions, and I'm afraid we have a hard stop at 15:15, but we do have some wine next door, so please come next door and grab Henry. Just before finishing, by chance, we're having a spate of food talks at the moment. This coming Thursday at 12:30, Nathan Sayre, who's a visitor here, is going to be talking about the cattle grain beef complex, maize, feedlots and British breeds and the rise of the modern food system. And then next Monday, the 22nd, Monday week, I beg your pardon, Steve Long will be talking about more productive future-proof crops via manipulation of photosynthesis. Long's work is absolutely extraordinary. It has the potential for being the biggest advance since Norman Borlaug, so that will be a super talk. Henry, it's an amazing tour de force you've given us this afternoon. The National Food Strategy, I believe, will be the most influential document on food in this country since the Second World War. So more power to your elbow, and thank you for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.